The desert stretched endless beneath a sky choked with smoke and fire. Somewhere in the distance, explosions painted the horizon in shades of orange and crimson, each detonation a heartbeat of destruction that had become as familiar as breathing over the past 12 years. Colonel Jack Mercer moved through the darkness with a burden across his shoulders that weighed far more than flesh and bone. The alien woman's blood had soaked through his uniform, leaving a trail of luminescent blue that glowed faintly against the sand. Her breathing came shallow and labored, each exhale a testament to wounds that should have killed her hours ago. Jack's legs burned with every step, his 52-year-old body screaming in protest against the impossible task he had set for himself. 3 wars had carved their lessons into his bones, had taught him when to fight and when to run, when to hold the line and when to let go. Nothing in those decades of service had prepared him for this moment, for the weight of an enemy queen dying in his arms while her own people hunted them both across the Mojave. His voice emerged rough and tired, carried away by the wind that swept across the dunes. I fought in 3 wars. I thought I'd seen everything, until I met her. Gunfire erupted from somewhere behind them, the distinctive crack of Valdorian plasma weapons splitting the night. Jack dropped to one knee, cradling the woman against his chest as he scanned the darkness for movement. Her eyes fluttered open, those strange silver irises catching the distant firelight like mirrors reflecting a dying sun. She tried to speak, but only blood came dark and thick, spilling across lips that had once commanded an empire spanning a dozen star systems. 72 hours earlier, Jack Mercer had been nobody. The transport truck rattled across the broken asphalt of Highway 127, its engine groaning under the strain of hauling ammunition crates toward the forward operating base at Baker. Jack kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, while his mind wandered through memories he couldn't quite escape. Fort Haven rose in the distance, a sprawling complex of prefabricated buildings and defensive fortifications that represented humanity's last stand in the Mojave sector. 12 years of war had transformed the California desert into a wasteland of craters and wreckage, the bones of fallen soldiers from both species scattered across the sand like forgotten prayers. He had driven this route 100 times since his demotion, had memorized every pothole and every checkpoint, had learned to find a certain peace in the monotony of hauling supplies while better men did the fighting. The insignia on his shoulder marked him as a corporal, and now a rank he had last held 30 years ago when he was barely old enough to shave. They had taken his eagles, had stripped away the silver birds that represented 3 decades of service, and had left him with nothing but a steering wheel and the ghosts of men he couldn't save. The passenger door swung open at the checkpoint, and a young soldier climbed into the cab with the easy grace of someone who hadn't yet learned what war could take from a man. Danny Reyes carried himself with the eager confidence of 24 years and 2 combat deployments, his dark eyes bright with an admiration that Jack had done nothing to earn. The kid had attached himself to Jack's supply run 6 months ago, had insisted on riding along despite the tedium, had asked questions that no one else bothered to ask anymore. Jack appreciated the company, even as he feared what it meant, what it said about a young man who found inspiration in a disgraced officer hauling ammunition crates. Danny settled into his seat and pulled the door shut, his rifle resting across his knees as the truck lurched back into motion. The silence between them stretched comfortable and familiar, the kind of quiet that came from hours spent together on roads that led nowhere worth going. Danny's voice broke the stillness with a question he had asked before, a question Jack suspected he would keep asking until he received an answer that satisfied him. "Do you ever regret it, Colonel, what you did at Firebase Echo?" Jack's jaw tightened at the memory, at the weight of a decision that had cost him everything except his conscience. Firebase Echo had been a slaughterhouse, a forward position overrun by Valdorian shock troops, while command ordered a general retreat. 12 wounded soldiers had been left behind in the chaos, men too broken to walk and too valuable to abandon. Jack had turned his convoy around against direct orders, had driven back into the kill zone with nothing but a rifle and a prayer, had loaded those 12 men into his vehicles while plasma fire turned the world into a furnace around them. All 12 had survived. Jack's career had not. The court-martial had been swift and merciless, a formality designed to make an example of an officer who valued lives over orders. They had offered him a dishonorable discharge, and he had negotiated it down to reduction in rank, had accepted the humiliation of driving trucks because the alternative meant leaving the fight entirely. His response came slow and measured, each word carrying the weight of 2 years spent making peace with a choice that had defined him. They took my rank, not my conscience. I can live with that. Danny nodded as though the answer confirmed something he had already known, something he had believed about the man beside him long before he found the courage to ask. The truck continued its journey across the broken landscape past the burned-out shells of vehicles that had fallen in battles neither of them could remember, past the memorials that marked where good soldiers had died fighting an enemy that seemed endless. The radio crackled with routine traffic, the voices of men and women coordinating the mundane logistics of a war that had ground on so long it had become a way of life rather than an emergency to be resolved. Jack listened with half an ear, his attention drifting toward the mountains that rose in the distance, their peaks crowned with the wreckage of a Valdorian cruiser that had fallen 3 years ago and still burned with fires that refused to die. The emergency broadcast cut through the routine chatter like a knife through flesh, the voice sharp with urgency that made Jack's hands tighten on the wheel. All units in Sector 7, Valdorian ship down in grid reference 479er. Multiple contacts inbound. All combat elements respond. Transport and support units hold position and await further orders. Jack slowed the truck as he processed the information, his tactical mind already mapping the terrain, calculating distances and threat vectors from decades of habit he couldn't break. The crash site lay 15 miles to the northeast, well within the contested zone where neither side maintained permanent control. Danny leaned forward in his seat, his young face tight with the excitement of potential action, the eagerness of a soldier who hadn't yet learned to fear the sound of guns. The radio continued its stream of urgent traffic units, calling in their positions, and estimated arrival times, the machinery of war grinding into motion with the efficiency of long practice. Jack should have continued to the base. His orders were clear, his role defined by the reduction in rank that had stripped away his authority to make decisions that mattered. Transport units held position and awaited orders. Those were the rules that governed his existence, now the boundaries that contained whatever remained of the officer he had once been. He pressed the accelerator, instead felt the truck surge forward as he turned toward the crash site, toward the sound of guns that had already begun to echo across the desert. Danny looked at him with surprise that faded quickly into understanding, into the recognition that some men couldn't be contained by rules that asked them to stand aside while others fought and died. "Colonel, our orders!" Jack cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "Command doesn't know what's out there. We do a quick recon report, what we see, and pull back. 5 minutes, then we're gone." The lie came easy because it had to, because the truth would have required Jack to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. He couldn't stand aside. He couldn't wait and listen while men died within reach of help he could provide. The court-martial hadn't changed that fundamental truth about who he was, had only forced him to find new ways to be the soldier he had always been. Danny accepted the explanation with a nod that suggested he saw through the pretense, but chose not to challenge it, chose to follow the man who had become his teacher into whatever waited ahead. The battle announced itself before they crested the final ridge, the sounds of combat rising from the valley below, like the screams of the damned. Jack stopped the truck and grabbed his rifle, moving to a position where he could observe without being seen. The Valdorian ship had carved a trench through the desert floor, its hull torn open by whatever had brought it down, fires burning in compartments that spilled alien technology across the sand. American forces had arrived first and established a perimeter, their positions marked by muzzle flashes and the distinctive bark of conventional weapons. Valdorian troops poured from the wreckage in waves, their silver armor gleaming in the firelight, their plasma rifles cutting through the darkness with beams of coherent light that turned sand to glass wherever they struck. The American line was buckling under the assault soldiers falling back in fighting retreat, while their commanders screamed for reinforcements that wouldn't arrive in time. Jack counted the enemy, assessed their formations, recognized the tactics of a force that intended to recover something from that crashed ship regardless of the cost. Danny crouched beside him, his breath coming fast and shallow, his rifle gripped tight in hands that had started to tremble with adrenaline. "There's too many of them. We should call it in and pull back." Jack didn't respond because his attention had locked onto something moving at the edge of the battle, a group of Valdorian soldiers dragging a figure from the wreckage. The figure struggled weakly against their grip, and even at this distance, Jack could see the dark stains spreading across pale robes that marked them as wounded. The soldiers threw the figure to the ground with contemptuous force, and one of them raised his weapon to deliver a killing blow. Another soldier grabbed his arm and pulled him back, gesturing toward the Americans who represented a more immediate threat. They left the figure lying in the sand and ran to join their comrades, dismissing whatever they had dragged from the ship as unworthy of attention or ammunition. The American line collapsed 30 seconds later. Soldiers scattered in every direction, their retreat becoming a rout as Valdorian forces overwhelmed their positions. Jack grabbed Danny and pulled him back toward the truck, his mind racing through options that narrowed with every passing moment. The road back to base was cut off by enemy forces advancing from the south. The terrain to the west offered no cover, no place to hide a vehicle that would stand out against the open desert. East meant the mountains meant rough terrain that would slow them down but might provide concealment if they abandoned the truck and continued on foot. We go east. Stay low, stay quiet, and don't stop moving until we reach the ridge. Danny nodded and followed as Jack led them away from the truck, away from the battle toward the dark mass of mountains that rose against the stars. The sounds of combat faded behind them as they moved, replaced by the whisper of wind across sand and the pounding of their own hearts. Jack's legs ached from the unaccustomed exertion, his body reminding him with every step that he was no longer the young man who had humped through jungles and deserts without complaint. He pushed through the pain because stopping meant dying, because the Valdorians would sweep this area within hours, and anyone caught in the open would not survive to see morning. They had covered perhaps a mile when Danny grabbed his arm and pointed toward a cluster of rocks that offered temporary shelter. Jack nodded and changed direction, leading them into the shadows where they could catch their breath and assess their situation. The figure lay crumpled against the base of the largest boulder, its pale robes stained dark with blood that reflected the starlight in shades of blue and black. Jack's rifle came up on instinct, his finger finding the trigger as he sighted on what could only be a Valdorian survivor from the crash. The figure didn't move, didn't react to their approach, and after a moment Jack realized it wasn't capable of threatening them. He moved closer, his weapon still raised, and the details resolved themselves in the darkness. Female, or at least possessing the characteristics that humans associated with femininity. Her features were sharper than a human's, would be her cheekbones high and angular, her ears tapering to points that swept back against silver hair matted with blood and dirt. Her eyes were closed, her breathing so shallow that Jack had to watch for several seconds to confirm she still lived. Her legs ended in ragged stumps below the knee, the wounds cauterized by whatever weapon had inflicted them, the pale flesh scorched and blackened around edges that would never heal without advanced medical intervention. Danny's voice came rough with hatred earned through 2 years of watching friends die. Valdorian, we should leave her. Jack should have agreed. The woman was enemy, a member of the species that had invaded Earth 12 years ago and had killed millions in their campaign of conquest. Every soldier learned to hate the Valdorians, to see them as monsters, rather than people to suppress whatever empathy might interfere with the business of killing. Jack had killed his share, and more had pulled triggers and thrown grenades and called in strikes that had ended Valdorian lives without hesitation or regret. This was different. This woman lay broken and abandoned, her own people having left her to die in the desert while they pursued objectives that apparently mattered more than her survival. Her lips moved, and Jack leaned closer to hear the words that emerged barely louder than a whisper. Kill me, please. Don't let them take me. The English surprised him, the desperation in her voice more than the language itself. Valdorians learned human languages, as a matter of course used them for interrogation and psychological warfare, and the thousand small cruelties that made occupation bearable for the occupiers. This woman wasn't trying to deceive him or manipulate him. She was begging for death with the sincerity of someone who had nothing left to lose, who preferred the mercy of a bullet to whatever fate awaited her if her own kind found her alive. Jack lowered his rifle and crouched beside her, his knees protesting as they took his weight. Her eyes opened at his movement, silver irises catching the starlight, focusing on his face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. He had seen that look before in the eyes of men who had given up hope, who had accepted their deaths and wanted it only for the ending to come quickly. He had seen it in his own reflection after Firebase Echo, after the court-martial, after his wife had taken their daughter and left him alone with nothing but his conscience and his ghosts. I don't kill unarmed people, not even enemies. Her expression shifted from desperation to confusion, her brow furrowing as she processed words that clearly made no sense within her understanding of war. Jack pulled his medical kit from his pack and began assessing her wounds, his hands moving with the efficiency of 30 years of training, even as his mind struggled to justify what he was doing. The stumps of her legs were stable, the cauterization having prevented blood loss that would otherwise have killed her within minutes. Her other injuries were less severe cuts and contusions that spoke of violence beyond whatever had taken her legs of rough handling by people who had ceased to see her as worthy of care. You are human. I am Valdorian. We are enemies. Jack didn't look up from his work, his fingers applying antiseptic gel to a gash across her forehead. Yeah, I noticed. Hold still. Danny kept his rifle trained on the woman, his young face twisted with the conflict between his hatred of the enemy and his respect for the man who was treating her. Jack could feel the weight of that gaze, could sense the questions forming in Danny's mind, questions about duty and loyalty, and the limits of mercy in a war that had no room for such complications. He finished his initial treatment and sat back on his heels, looking at the woman with eyes that had learned to see past the surface of things during decades of conflict across 3 different wars. What's your name? She hesitated, her silver eyes searching his face for some sign of the trap she clearly expected. Serafina, I was Queen Serafina of the Valdorian Empire. The words hit Jack like a physical blow, the implications cascading through his mind with the force of a detonation. The Valdorian queen, the woman who had ordered the invasion of Earth, who had commanded the fleets that had burned cities and killed millions, lay broken at his feet, begging for death. Danny's rifle came up sharply, his finger tightening on the trigger as he recognized the name that had become synonymous with everything humanity hated about the enemy. Jack raised his hand, stopping the young soldier before he could fire his voice, carrying an authority that his rank no longer supported. Stand down, Corporal. That's an order. Danny's face contorted with disbelief with the betrayal of a soldier whose hero had just revealed himself as something other than expected. His rifle wavered but didn't lower his conflict, visible in every line of his body. Jack held his gaze, held the silence until finally Danny lowered his weapon with a curse that expressed everything he couldn't put into words. Jack turned back to Serafina, back to the queen who had become a broken woman, abandoned by her own people in the desert. Why did they leave you? Why did your own soldiers treat you like that? Her laugh came bitter and brief, a sound that held no humor. Because I am no longer queen. Because Kael has taken my throne and my daughter and everything I ever valued. Because weakness is betrayal in Valdorian law, and I am now the weakest creature in the Empire. The name meant nothing to Jack, but the pain in her voice spoke volumes about what it represented. He processed the information, fitted it into a framework of understanding that began to shift his perception of the war he had fought for 12 years. A coup within the Valdorian Empire, a queen deposed and left to die a power struggle that had apparently reached its climax in the skies above the Mojave. Whatever had brought her ship down had not been American weapons. The Valdorians had shot down their own queen, had attempted to assassinate her, and had nearly succeeded. His father's voice echoed from memories decades old from lessons taught in the kitchen of their small house in Ohio, while Jack was still young enough to believe that the world made sense. A man is judged by how he treats his enemies when they are defeated. Any fool can be cruel to the helpless. It takes strength to show mercy. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, his fingers finding the worn photograph that he carried everywhere despite the pain it brought. His daughter Sarah smiled at him from the image, her face frozen at 15 years old, the last age at which she had looked at him with anything other than disappointment. She was 25 now, a woman he barely knew who had chosen her mother's side in a divorce that had been inevitable from the moment Jack had put the service above his family for the 100th time. He hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, hadn't heard her voice since she had told him that she never wanted to see him again, that the father who was never there was no father at all. Serafina watched him look at the photograph, her silver eyes catching the pain that he couldn't quite hide. You have a child. A daughter. She doesn't speak to me anymore. My own fault. I have a daughter as well. Lyra. Kael has taken her. He will use her against me, will twist her into something I cannot recognize, and there is nothing I can do to stop him. The parallel struck Jack with a force that made his chest tighten, that made the decision forming in his mind seem less like madness and more like destiny. Two parents who had lost their daughters, one through war and one through failure, both broken in ways that might never heal. He looked at the woman who should have been his enemy, who was his enemy by every measure that mattered in this war, and saw instead a mother whose child had been stolen, a leader whose people had betrayed her, a queen who had been reduced to begging strangers for death. Can you move at all? We need to get out of here before they sweep this area. Her confusion returned deeper than before as she struggled to comprehend what he was offering. You would help me after everything my people have done to yours. Jack slid his arms beneath her body and lifted his muscles, straining against weight that seemed impossibly light for a being her size. I've been a bad father. Maybe helping you is my way of making it right with the universe. He started walking before she could respond, before Danny could voice the objections that were clearly building behind his young soldier's eyes. The mountains rose ahead of them, dark against a sky that was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. Every step took them farther from the battle, farther from safety, deeper into territory where death waited in 1,000 different forms. Serafina's arms wrapped around his neck for support, her head resting against his shoulder, as her strength failed her, as the blood loss and trauma finally began to claim their due. Jack kept moving because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant confronting the reality that he was carrying the enemy queen through a war zone while his own people died fighting her forces. Danny fell into step beside him, his rifle at the ready, his face a mask of conflict that hadn't resolved itself into anything resembling acceptance. The young soldier's voice came tight with emotions he was struggling to control. Colonel, this is treason. If anyone finds out what we're doing, then don't let anyone find out. And it's Corporal now. I'm just a truck driver, remember? The response didn't satisfy Danny, couldn't satisfy him because it didn't address the fundamental wrongness of what they were doing. Jack understood the young man's conflict because he shared it, because every step he took carried him further across a line he had never expected to cross. He was betraying his country, his species, everything he had spent his life defending, murdered a woman whose hands were stained with the blood of millions. The weight of that truth should have crushed him, should have forced him to set her down and walk away, to choose duty over whatever impulse had driven him to this moment. Instead, he kept walking. The sun had cleared the horizon by the time they reached the cave system that Jack remembered from reconnaissance reports filed years ago and forgotten by everyone except those who made it their business to remember such things. The caves offered shelter from both the elements and the enemy, a place to hide while they figured out their next move. Jack carried Serafina deep into the darkness, found a relatively smooth section of floor, and set her down as gently as his exhausted arms could manage. She winced at the movement, her wounds having stiffened during the journey. But she didn't cry out, didn't give voice to pain that must have been agonizing. Jack respected that, recognized it as the discipline of a leader who had learned not to show weakness, even when weakness was all that remained. Danny positioned himself at the cave entrance, his rifle pointed toward the light, his body language speaking of a soldier who had accepted his role as guardian, even if he couldn't accept the person he was guarding. Jack pulled his remaining supplies from his pack and assessed what they had to work with. Water for perhaps 2 days if they rationed carefully. Food for less than that. Medical supplies already depleted by the treatment he had given Serafina. A radio that might or might not reach friendly forces depending on the terrain and the enemy's jamming. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Serafina's voice reached him from the darkness, weak but clear. You have not asked me why I did it, why I invaded your world. Jack didn't look at her as he organized their supplies. Does it matter the war happened? People died. Nothing you say can change that. It matters to me. It matters that you understand who you're helping, what I have done. He turned to face her, then saw the need in her silver eyes, the desperate desire to be seen as something more than the monster humanity had made her into. The need surprised him because it seemed so human, so familiar, so like the need he had felt during his court-martial to explain that his choices had meaning beyond the simple fact of disobedience. He sat down against the cave wall, his legs grateful for the rest, and waited for her to speak. I never wanted this war. When my mother was assassinated, when I took the throne, the War Council had already committed us to the invasion. Kale was their leader, the one who convinced them that your species was a threat that had to be neutralized before you developed the technology to reach our worlds. I was young and alone and surrounded by advisors who saw conquest as the only path to security. I ordered the invasion because I believed I had no choice, because my daughter's life depended on my compliance with their demands. They held your daughter hostage to control you. Her laugh came bitter and broken. From the day she was born, KL took her from my arms and placed her in what he called protective custody. What he promised was for her safety in a universe full of dangers. I was 20 years on the throne before I understood that I was not the ruler of the Valdorian Empire. I was its prisoner, controlled through the child I loved more than power, more than glory, more than life itself. Jack processed this information, fitted it into his understanding of a war that had suddenly become far more complicated than the simple narrative of invasion and resistance. A queen held hostage through her own child, forced to order atrocities, while the true power rested in the hands of those who threatened what she loved most. It didn't absolve her of responsibility, couldn't undo the death she had ordered, or the suffering she had caused, but it added a dimension of tragedy to a figure humanity had learned to see as nothing but evil. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? I want you to understand that I am not asking you to save a monster. I am asking you to save a mother who has lost everything, who has nothing left except the hope that somewhere someone might help me rescue my daughter from the man who has stolen her. Danny's voice cut through the darkness from his position at the cave entrance. We've got movement. 3 Valdorian soldiers heading this way. Jack moved before conscious thought could catch up, his body responding to the threat with the automatic efficiency of decades of training. He grabbed his rifle and joined Danny at the entrance, watching as 3 armored figures picked their way across the terrain toward their hiding place. The soldiers moved with the careful precision of a search pattern, their weapons ready, their attention focused on the ground ahead. They were looking for tracks, for signs of passage, for any indication that someone had survived the battle and fled into the mountains. Stay with her. Keep quiet. I'll draw them away. Danny grabbed his arm, in his young face tight with fear and determination. Colonel, you can't. I can, and I will. If I'm not back in an hour, take her to the rally point at grid reference 732. General Morrison will know what to do with her. He didn't wait for acknowledgement, didn't give Danny time to argue or object. Jack moved out of the cave and began working his way through the rocks, using terrain and shadow to circle around behind the approaching soldiers. 30 years of training guided his movements, made him a ghost in the morning light, invisible to enemies who had never learned to fear a species they considered inferior. He reached a position above and behind them, his rifle settling against his shoulder, his breathing slowing to the steady rhythm that preceded violence. The first soldier died without knowing he was under attack. Jack's bullet finding the gap between helmet and armor with the precision of a marksman who had been shooting since before these aliens had discovered Earth. The second spun toward the sound of the shot and caught the next round in his chest, the impact throwing him backward against the rocks. The third raised his plasma rifle and fired blindly toward Jack's position, the beam scorching stone where Jack had been a moment before. Jack moved again, circled, came at the soldier from an angle he couldn't anticipate, and put him down with a knife through the throat before he could track the new threat. 3 bodies lay in the sand by the time his heart stopped racing, 3 enemies who would never report what they had found or where they had found it. Jack cleaned his knife on the fallen soldier's armor and began the work of concealing the evidence, of buying time for whatever came next. His body ached from exertions it was no longer designed to handle. His hands trembled with the adrenaline that came after violence rather than during it, but his mind remained clear-focused on the tactical reality of their situation. He returned to the cave to find Danny standing guard over Serafina with a rifle that no longer pointed directly at her, the young soldier's hatred having given way to something more complicated during the hour Jack had been gone. Serafina watched him enter with eyes that held a new kind of respect, a recognition that the human who had saved her was more than the simple soldier she had assumed him to be. You killed them, all 3. Jack nodded and set down his rifle. They won't be the last. We need to move soon, find a place where I can call for extraction. They will not stop hunting me. KL cannot allow me to live, cannot allow any possibility that I might return to challenge his claim to the throne. Every soldier in the Empire will be searching for me. The implications of her words settled over Jack like a weight he hadn't anticipated, a burden that added itself to all the others he already carried. He had committed himself to saving this woman without fully understanding what that commitment would cost, without recognizing that he had placed himself between a queen and an empire that wanted her dead. Danny's face reflected the same realization, the same dawning horror at the scope of what they had undertaken. Jack's response came simple and direct, the only response he knew how to give. Then we'd better stay ahead of them. He helped Serafina up, lifted her back into his arms, and began walking deeper into the mountains, while the sun climbed toward its peak in the desert below, filled with soldiers searching for a queen who had chosen to trust her enemies rather than surrender to her own kind. The weight on his shoulders had never felt heavier, but somehow for the first time in 2 years, Jack Mercer felt like a soldier again. The days stretched endless as they moved through the mountain passes, following trails that Jack remembered from maps studied years ago, and hoping that memory would prove more reliable than hope. Serafina drifted in and out of consciousness, her body struggling against injuries that would have killed a human long before now. Her Valdorian constitution, the only thing keeping her alive while they searched for safety that might not exist. Danny scouted ahead, his young legs covering ground that Jack's could not, his reports coming back with increasing urgency as the enemy presence in the area grew more concentrated. They were running out of time, out of options, out of the luck that had kept them alive this far. The drone appeared without warning, dropping from the sky like a mechanical predator that had finally located its prey. Jack dove for cover as it scanned the area, its sensors sweeping back and forth across terrain that offered nowhere to hide. Serafina lay exposed on the ground where he had set her, her silver eyes fixed on the machine that had come to confirm her death or ensure it. The drone's speakers crackled with a voice that carried across the desert with the clarity of absolute authority. Queen Serafina, High Commander Kael sends his regards. Your head is worth 10 million units to whoever brings it to him. The human with you has no value whatsoever. Kill him on sight. Jack raised his rifle, knowing the shot would bring more drones, more soldiers, more enemies than they could possibly hope to survive. The drone's weapons began to charge energy, building in systems designed to vaporize organic matter with surgical precision. Time slowed as Jack calculated angles and distances as he prepared to take the shot that would buy them seconds at best, as he accepted that this might be where his story ended. Serafina's hand touched his arm, and something passed between them that he couldn't name, couldn't describe, couldn't have anticipated from an enemy he had known for less than a day. Her voice reached him calm and clear, cutting through the chaos with the authority of a queen who had not forgotten how to command. You are more than you know, Jack Mercer. Whatever happens next, remember that. The drone fired. The plasma beam carved through the air, where Jack's head had been a heartbeat before superheated energy, turning rock to slag as he rolled behind a boulder and brought his rifle up in a single fluid motion. Time compressed into fragments of sensation and instinct, the old training taking over, as conscious thought retreated to make room for the predator that lived beneath the surface of every soldier who had survived long enough to learn what survival truly cost. The drone adjusted its targeting array sensors, recalibrating for the new angle weapon, cycling for another shot that would not miss. Jack's finger found the trigger with the familiarity of 30 years, his eye finding the scope, his breath releasing in the controlled exhale that preceded precision violence. The shot traveled 200 meters in less than a second, punched through the drone's sensor housing at the exact point where armor plating met optical array, and detonated the power cell that fed its weapon systems. The machine fell from the sky in pieces, trailing smoke and sparks across the desert floor like a mechanical comet, burning through atmosphere it was never designed to enter. Danny emerged from cover with his rifle raised, scanning the sky for additional threats, while his young face struggled to process what he had just witnessed. The shot had been impossible, the kind of precision that existed only in recruitment videos and the exaggerated stories that soldiers told in bars when they wanted to impress civilians who had never held a weapon. Jack lowered his rifle and moved towards Serafina, his hands already reaching for the medical kit that held supplies too depleted to address her injuries properly. She watched him approach with those silver eyes that seemed to see more than they should, that pierced through the walls he had built around the parts of himself he preferred to keep hidden. That was not the shooting of a transport driver. Jack didn't respond as he checked her wounds, his fingers probing gently for signs of fresh bleeding or infection. The truth of what he had been before his demotion was not something he discussed, not something he acknowledged even to himself most days. Special Operations Command had trained him as a designated marksman during his first decade of service, had honed his natural talent into something that generals called an asset and enemies called a nightmare. He had killed from distances that most soldiers couldn't see clearly, had ended lives with the dispassionate efficiency of a surgeon removing tumors from healthy tissue. The court-martial had buried that history along with his rank, had reduced him to a truck driver, whose skills were considered too valuable to discharge, but too dangerous to acknowledge. We need to move. That drone transmitted our location before I brought it down. They'll have teams converging on this position within the hour. Danny helped him lift Serafina, the young soldier's earlier hostility, having mellowed into something closer to reluctant acceptance. The mountains offered a maze of canyons and caves that might conceal their passage if they moved quickly enough, if their luck held long enough, if the universe decided that three fugitives deserved another chance at survival. Jack led them deeper into the wilderness, following paths that existed only in memories of maps studied years ago, trusting instincts that had kept him alive through situations that should have killed him a dozen times over. Serafina's voice reached him weak but urgent as they moved through a narrow canyon that offered shade from the brutal sun. The drone's wreckage. There will be a tracking module in the debris. If we do not disable it, every Valdorian unit in the sector will know exactly where we are. Jack stopped and looked back at the distant plume of smoke that marked where the drone had fallen. The wreckage lay perhaps half a mile behind them, an easy distance to cover if he moved alone and fast. The risk of returning was weighed against the certainty of being tracked, the mathematics of survival calculating itself in his mind with the cold precision of experience. He set Serafina down against a rock formation that provided concealment and turned to Danny with instructions that left no room for interpretation. Stay with her, keep her hydrated, keep her quiet, and keep your weapon ready. I'll be back in 20 minutes. The young soldier nodded, his jaw set with determination that suggested he understood the stakes even if he couldn't fully accept the situation that had created them. Jack moved back through the canyon at a pace that pushed his aging body toward limits it had not tested in years, his legs burning with exertion, while his mind focused on the task ahead. The drone's wreckage came into view sooner than expected, the machine's components scattered across the sand in patterns that told the story of its destruction. Jack approached cautiously, his rifle ready for threats that might have arrived before him, his eyes scanning for the tracking module that Serafina had described. The device sat nestled among burned circuitry and shattered armor, plating a small cylinder that pulsed with faint blue light, indicating active transmission. Jack reached for it, then hesitated as he realized he had no idea how to disable Valdorian technology without triggering whatever failsafes the aliens had built into their equipment. His radio crackled with Serafina's voice, weak but clear, transmitted through the communicator Danny had given her. The cylinder with the blue light, there is a seam along its length. Press both ends simultaneously and twist counterclockwise. The transmission will cease. Jack followed her instructions, felt the device click in his hands, watched the blue light fade to darkness. He pocketed the disabled tracker and began the journey back to his companions, his mind turning over questions that had begun to accumulate since the moment he had first seen her lying broken in the sand. She had been a queen, a ruler of an empire that spanned star systems, a commander of fleets that had brought humanity to its knees. Now she lay helpless in a canyon, teaching her enemy how to evade her own people's technology, trusting her survival to a species she had spent 12 years trying to conquer. The cave system opened before them like a wound in the earth, its entrance hidden behind a fall of boulders that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Jack had learned of these caves from a Navajo friend who had served beside him in the early years of the war, a man who had shared the secrets of his ancestral lands with a fellow soldier he trusted with his life. The friend was dead, now killed in a Valdorian ambush 3 years ago, but his knowledge lived on in Jack's memory like a gift from beyond the grave. They descended into the darkness, following passages that grew cooler and more humid as they went deeper until they reached a chamber large enough to provide shelter and concealment for days if necessary. Jack laid Serafina on the smoothest section of floor he could find and began assessing her condition with growing concern. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested infection had begun to set into her wounds, her temperature elevated beyond what he knew to be normal for Valdorian physiology. The medical supplies he carried were designed for human biology, their effectiveness on alien tissue uncertain at best. He needed antibiotics, antiseptics, treatments that existed only in hospitals and medical facilities far beyond his reach. "You are worried," Her observation came simple and direct, the voice of a leader who had learned to read the faces of those around her during centuries of navigating political waters that could kill as surely as any weapon. Jack didn't deny the truth she had perceived, didn't see the point in pretending confidence he couldn't feel. You're developing an infection. I don't have the supplies to treat it properly, and I don't know enough about your biology to improvise effectively. Serafina's eyes closed as she processed this information, her face revealing nothing of whatever calculations were running through her mind. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decisions made long ago, of knowledge she had hoped never to share with an enemy. There are plants in this desert. Your people used them for medicine before your technology made such knowledge obsolete. The one you call sagebrush contains compounds that will slow the infection. The one you call yarrow will help control fever. If you can find them, if you can prepare them correctly, they may buy us time. Jack stared at her with surprise he couldn't hide, with questions that multiplied faster than he could articulate them. She knew human medicine, knew the traditional remedies of peoples she had come to conquer, knew things that most humans had forgotten in their rush toward modernity. The contradiction of it struck him as profound, as significant in ways he couldn't quite define. How do you know about Native American medicine? Her laugh came soft and bitter, a sound that held centuries of regret. I have studied your species for 200 years, Jack Mercer. I know your history, your cultures, your strengths and weaknesses. I know that your ancestors survived in these deserts for thousands of years without the technology you now depend upon. I know that wisdom does not require advancement, that knowledge does not require conquest. I know many things that I wish I had understood before I ordered the invasion of your world. Danny's voice interrupted from his position near the cave entrance, his tone carrying urgency that demanded immediate attention. Colonel, I've got movement on the ridge. Looks like a patrol, maybe 6 or 7 contacts heading away from us, but sweeping the area. Jack moved to join the young soldier, his eyes finding the distant figures that Danny had spotted. Valdorian soldiers in full combat gear, their movements suggesting a search pattern that would eventually bring them to this location if they maintained their current trajectory. Time pressed against them from every direction, enemies multiplying, while their options contracted toward a point that offered no escape. Stay here. Keep her alive. I'm going to find those plants she mentioned. The desert provided what he needed with the reluctance of a miser parting with treasure, each plant requiring search and identification that consumed precious minutes from a timeline already stretched too thin. Jack gathered sagebrush and yarrow and other specimens that his Navajo friend had taught him to recognize during long nights of sharing knowledge beside campfires that felt like lifetimes ago. He prepared the remedies as best he could, remember grinding leaves between stones, mixing compounds with water from his dwindling supply, creating treatments that might save Serafina's life or might do nothing at all. She accepted his ministrations without complaint, drinking the bitter preparations with the discipline of someone who had learned to endure far worse than unpleasant tastes. The fever held steady through the first hour, then began to drop as the plant compounds worked their ancient magic on biology that had evolved beneath a different sun. Jack watched the color return to her skin by degrees, watched her breathing ease into patterns that suggested rest rather than distress, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been tight. You saved my life again. Her words reached him from the edge of sleep, her silver eyes half closed, but still watching, still assessing, still trying to understand the human who had become her unlikely guardian. Jack settled against the cave wall and allowed himself to rest his body, demanding recovery from exertions that had pushed it beyond reasonable limits. We're not out of this yet. Save your gratitude for when we actually survive. The silence that followed stretched comfortable and strange, two enemies sharing space and breath, and the peculiar intimacy of mutual vulnerability. Jack's mind drifted toward questions he had suppressed since lifting her from the sand, questions about who she had been before war had made her into a symbol of everything humanity feared. Tell me about before the invasion, before you became what we made you into. Who were you? Serafina's eyes opened fully, her gaze fixing on some point beyond the cave walls, beyond the present moment, beyond the weight of centuries that had shaped her into the creature she had become. Her voice emerged soft and distant, the tone of someone speaking from memories that hurt to touch. I was 80 years old when my mother was assassinated, young by Valdorian standards, Barely past childhood in the way your species measures such things. The throne passed to me because there was no one else, because the War Council had eliminated every other claimant in their campaign to ensure that whoever ruled would rule according to their designs. Kale was their champion, their chosen instrument, the general who had helped me avenge my mother's death by destroying the faction they blamed for her murder. She paused, her face twisting with emotions that transcended species, that spoke of betrayal so profound it had shaped the course of her entire existence. I believed him. For 150 years, and I believed that KL was my most loyal servant, my most trusted advisor, the one person in all the empire who wanted nothing from me except the chance to serve. I believed him when he told me that Earth posed a threat that had to be neutralized before your species developed the technology to reach our worlds. I believed him when he told me that conquest was mercy, that subjugation was protection, that the deaths of millions were necessary to prevent the deaths of billions. Jack's hands clenched into fists as he listened, as the anger that had sustained him through 12 years of war found new fuel in the manipulation she described. She had been used, controlled, shaped into a weapon by forces that had hidden their true intentions behind masks of loyalty and service. The revelation didn't absolve her of responsibility, couldn't undo the suffering she had caused, but it added dimensions to her guilt that complicated the simple narrative of good and evil that made war possible. You ordered the execution of prisoners, 1,000 human soldiers killed on your command. I was there when we found the bodies. Her face crumpled with pain that seemed too raw to be feigned, too immediate to be the product of political calculation. Yes, I gave that order because the War Council demanded it, because KL told me that showing mercy would encourage resistance, because my daughter's life depended on my compliance with their demands. I gave that order, and I have seen their faces every night since. 1,000 voices that cry out in my dreams, asking why, asking what they did to deserve such an end. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of atrocities that could never be undone, of choices that had stained her soul in ways that no amount of regret could cleanse. Jack looked at the woman who had ordered the deaths of his comrades, who had commanded the forces that had killed his friends and destroyed his world, and found that hatred had become something more complicated than he knew how to name. And now, if you had the power to change things, to undo what you've done, would you? I would give everything I have, everything I am, to bring back even one of those 1,000 lives. I would surrender my throne, my empire, my own existence, if it would restore what I have taken from your people. But such bargains do not exist, Jack Mercer. The dead remain dead, and the living must carry the weight of what we have done until our own deaths release us from the burden. Her voice faded as exhaustion claimed her, her eyes closing as the fever-fighting remedies pulled her towards sleep that her body desperately needed. Jack watched her breathe, watched the rise and fall of her chest beneath robes stained with blood, both human and Valdorian, and wondered what it meant that he had begun to see her as something other than the enemy he had been taught to hate. The scream tore him from shallow sleep with the violence of an explosion, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the cave with intensity that seemed impossible from a throat so weakened by injury. Serafina thrashed against the stone floor, her eyes wide but unseeing, her hands clawing at air as if fighting invisible attackers. The name burst from her lips with desperation that transcended language, that spoke of love, so fierce it had survived centuries of separation and manipulation. Lyra, no, please, not my daughter. Lyra! Jack reached her side and gripped her shoulders, trying to anchor her to the present, to pull her back from whatever nightmare had seized control of her mind. Her silver eyes found his face but didn't recognize him, didn't see the cave or the danger or the reality of their situation. She saw only the horrors that played behind her eyelids, the fears that had haunted her since the day her child had been taken from her arms. She's just a baby, 50 years old, barely more than an infant by our standards. She doesn't understand why her mother cannot come to her, why she must stay with the uncle who smiles while planning her destruction. She calls for me in the night, and I cannot answer. She reaches for me, and I cannot hold her. The revelation struck Jack with force that stole his breath, that reframed everything he understood about the woman he had chosen to save. Her daughter was a child, not the adult he had imagined, not the political pawn he had assumed. A little girl of perhaps 8 years in human terms, trapped in the hands of enemies who would use her suffering to control her mother and her death to consolidate their power. Danny appeared at his side, his young face pale with the shock of witnessing emotions so raw and primal. The hatred that had colored his every interaction with Serafina seemed to waver in the face of her anguish, the simple categories of enemy and ally proving inadequate to contain the complexity of what they were witnessing. "Colonel, what do we do?" Jack didn't have an answer, didn't know how to respond to a question that had no good options. He held Serafina until her thrashing subsided, until the nightmare released its grip and allowed her to return to consciousness that offered little improvement over the terrors of sleep. She looked at him with eyes that held shame and grief and something that might have been gratitude, her walls crumbling in the aftermath of vulnerability she had not chosen to reveal. "I am sorry, I did not mean for you to see that. Your daughter. How long has Kyle had her?" "Since her birth. The War Council took her from me before I could even hold her properly, before I could memorize her face or learn the sound of her cry. They told me it was for her protection, that enemies of the throne would target her if her location were known. I believed them because I wanted to believe, because the alternative was too terrible to accept." The pattern of manipulation extended backward through her entire reign, through centuries of servitude disguised as sovereignty. They had taken her child to ensure her compliance, had used the love of a mother as a chain more effective than any physical restraint. Every order she had given, every atrocity she had authorized, had been purchased with threats against a daughter she had never been allowed to truly know. The sound of voices reached them from the cave entrance, harsh and human and unmistakably hostile. Danny raised his rifle and moved toward the sound, his body positioning itself between the threat and the people he had been ordered to protect. Jack grabbed his own weapon and joined him, his tactical mind assessing the situation, even as his heart sank with the recognition of what they faced. Desert raiders. The human scavengers who had made the war zone their hunting ground emerged from the tunnel with weapons drawn and greed painted across faces hardened by years of profiting from the suffering of others. 6 of them armed with a mixture of human and Valdorian equipment, their leader a scarred giant whose eyes found Serafina with the calculating hunger of a predator that had spotted wounded prey. "Well, well, what do we have here? A couple of soldiers playing nurse to a Valdorian bitch." Jack kept his rifle steady, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent commanding men in situations far worse than this. "We're just passing through. No need for trouble." The leader laughed, a sound devoid of humor or mercy. "No trouble at all, friend. You hand over the alien, we let you walk away. Simple transaction, everybody wins. She's not for sale." "Everything's for sale out here. You know what the Valdorians are paying for her? 10 million units. Enough to buy a small country, enough to set my boys up for life. You really think your principles are worth dying for?" Danny's finger tightened on his trigger, his young body coiled with the tension of someone preparing to fight against odds that mathematics said he couldn't beat. Jack calculated distances and angles, counted weapons, and assessed threats, and arrived at conclusions that offered no path to victory through conventional means. The leader raised his weapon, his patience exhausted, his decision made. "Last chance, soldier. Step aside or die with her." The attack came faster than thought, the raiders moving with the coordinated efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Jack fired twice, dropped 2 of them before they could close the distance, then took a rifle butt to the skull that sent him crashing to the cave floor with stars exploding behind his eyes. Danny went down, fighting his shots wild, but determined until numbers overwhelmed him and fists beat him into unconsciousness. Serafina lay where she had fallen, unable to run, unable to fight, unable to do anything except watch as the men who would sell her to her executioners approached with triumph in their eyes. The leader stood over her, his boot pressing against her chest, his face twisted with the contempt that the strong always showed the weak. "The mighty Valdorian queen reduced to this. Kale is going to love seeing you crawl." Something changed in Serafina's eyes, something that the raider didn't recognize until it was far too late to matter. The silver of her irises began to glow with inner light power. Rising from depths she had kept hidden for centuries, abilities she had suppressed out of fear of what they might make her become. Her voice emerged different than before, layered with harmonics that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. "You should not have touched him." The raider's head exploded, not metaphorically, not dramatically, but literally, his skull rupturing outward in a spray of bone and tissue that painted the cave walls with the evidence of power beyond human comprehension. The second raider died the same way, his dying scream cut short by the destruction of the brain that had produced it. The remaining raiders fled screaming into the darkness, their courage shattered by the display of ability they had never expected from a crippled prisoner. Serafina collapsed as the power faded, blood streaming from her nose and ears, her body paying the price for energies it was no longer strong enough to channel safely. Jack crawled toward her through the carnage, his head pounding from the blow that had felled him, his vision swimming with concussion that made the world tilt and spin. "What was that? What did you do?" Her answer came barely above a whisper, her strength utterly depleted by what she had done. "The royal gift, the power that makes Valdorian monarchs more than ordinary beings. I have hidden it since my coronation, have refused to use it because I feared what I might become if I embraced what it offered. I killed with my mind, Jack Mercer. I became the monster that I always feared I could be." He reached her side and gathered her broken body into his arms, holding her against his chest, while her blood soaked into his uniform and her tears fell hot against his skin. The power she had revealed changed everything, added dimensions to her story that he hadn't imagined, that transformed her from victim to something far more complicated. "You saved my life. I killed them with a thought. I felt their minds shatter, felt their consciousness extinguish like candles in a hurricane. The power enjoys killing Jack. It wants me to use it, wants me to become the weapon that Kyle always feared I could be. I have denied it for 2 centuries because I knew that once I started, I would never be able to stop." Danny stirred nearby, groaning as consciousness returned with all the pain that accompanied it. Jack helped him sit up, checked him for serious injuries, found nothing that wouldn't heal with time and rest. The young soldier's eyes found the bodies of the raiders, found the evidence of what had happened while he lay unconscious, and went wide with shock that transcended mere surprise. "Colonel, what the hell happened in here?" Jack looked at Serafina, at the woman who had revealed herself as something far more dangerous than the crippled queen he had thought he was saving. She met his gaze without flinching, without trying to hide what she was or what she had done, and in that moment of absolute honesty, he made a choice that would define everything that followed. "She saved us. That's all that matters." The radio crackled to life with static that resolved into voices. Jack recognized frequencies he had thought were beyond reach in these mountains. He grabbed the communicator and began transmitting, his words measured and careful despite the urgency that drove them. "This is Corporal Jack Mercer, formerly Colonel, Earth Defense Forces. I am requesting immediate extraction from grid reference 472. I have a high-value prisoner who has intelligence critical to ending this war. Repeat, I am requesting immediate extraction." The response came after a pause that stretched into eternity, a voice he recognized as belonging to the communications officer at Fort Haven. Mercer confirmed identity of prisoner. "Queen Serafina of the Valdorian Empire. She has defected and is willing to provide information about enemy command, structure, and operations." The silence that followed spoke louder than any words could have, the shock of his revelation traveling through channels that would reach the highest levels of command within minutes. When the voice returned, it carried a different tone, the clipped efficiency of someone following orders from authorities far above their pay grade. "Hold position. Mercer, extraction team en route. ETA 4 hours. Do not repeat, do not allow the prisoner to escape or communicate with enemy forces." Jack acknowledged the transmission and turned to find Serafina watching him with an expression he couldn't interpret, her silver eyes holding questions that the situation didn't allow time to answer. "They will not trust me. Your people will want me dead, will see me as the enemy regardless of what I offer them. They'll listen to what you have to say, and I'll make sure they don't hurt you." "You cannot make such promises, Jack Mercer. You are one man against forces that—" The drone's wreckage sparked to life, without warning, holographic projectors activating to display an image that made Serafina's blood run cold and her heart stop in her chest. A Valdorian male stood before them in shimmering light, his features aristocratic and cruel, his smile carrying satisfaction that spoke of plans finally reaching fruition. "Sister dearest, you have no idea how long I have waited for this moment." Serafina's face drained of what little color remained, her body trembling with shock that transcended physical weakness. Her voice emerged strangled and broken, carrying the weight of a betrayal that spanned centuries. "KL, how can you be? Your brother, oh sister, did you really think our mother would have only one heir? I was born 3 years after you hidden away and trained in secret while you played at being princess. Mother chose you as her successor because you were easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to shape into the puppet that the empire needed. The hologram stepped closer, its projected feet passing through stone as if the laws of physics meant nothing to it. I was sent away, sister, exiled to the military academies where I learned what true power meant, where I discovered that ruling from the shadows was far more effective than sitting on a throne surrounded by enemies. I arranged our mother's assassination. Did you know that I killed her so that you could take the throne and become my instrument? Seraphina's scream tore through the cave, a sound of anguish and rage that echoed off walls that had witnessed countless deaths, but nothing as terrible as this moment. She lunged toward the hologram, with hands that could not touch it, with fury that could not harm the image of the brother who had destroyed her life. Jack caught her before she could hurt herself, held her against his chest while she screamed and clawed at air that held nothing but light and malice. The hologram of KL watched with amusement that made Jack's blood boil with the satisfaction of a predator that had finally cornered prey it had been stalking for centuries. I have your daughter's sister, little Lyra, who calls for her mother every night and wonders why she never comes. I have raised her as my own. These past 50 years have taught her that her mother abandoned her, that the queen was too busy with her empire to care for a mere child. I will kill you, Kale. I will tear your empire apart stone by stone, and you will do nothing, sister. In 72 hours, I will execute your daughter before the assembled nobility of the empire. I will declare the old bloodline extinct and establish my own dynasty on the foundation of her bones. And you will watch from whatever hole you have crawled into, knowing that you could have saved her if only you had been stronger, braver, better than you are. The hologram flickered the damaged projector, struggling to maintain coherence. Kael's final words carried across the distance between them with clarity that ensured they would never be forgotten. 72 hours, sister. Enjoy them. They are the last your daughter will ever see. The image vanished, leaving silence and darkness and the echo of a countdown that had already begun. The helicopter descended through clouds of dust and sand, its rotors beating the air, with the rhythmic thunder of salvation arriving too late and too uncertain to trust. Jack shielded his eyes against the debris storm and watched the aircraft settle onto the canyon floor, its side doors sliding open to reveal soldiers in full combat gear who moved with the precision of men expecting to find enemies rather than allies. Danny stood beside him, his rifle lowered, but ready, his young face carrying the exhaustion of days spent running and fighting and questioning everything he had been taught about the nature of war. Seraphina lay against the rocks where Jack had placed her, her strength depleted by the psychic assault that had saved their lives. Her silver eyes tracking the approaching soldiers with the wariness of prey that had learned to distrust any hand that reached toward it. The squad leader emerged from the formation, his weapon trained on Seraphina, with the steady aim of a professional who had killed her kind many times before. His voice carried across the distance with authority that brooked no argument. Step away from the prisoner, Mercer. We have orders to secure her for transport. Jack positioned himself between the soldiers and Seraphina, his body a shield of flesh and bone against threats that could cut him down without effort. The gesture was futile, symbolic, a statement of intent, rather than a practical defense against superior numbers and firepower. He made it anyway because some principles mattered more than survival, because the woman behind him had trusted him with her life, and he would not betray that trust regardless of the cost. She's not a prisoner. She's a defector with intelligence that could end this war. Anyone who wants to hurt her goes through me first. The squad leader's finger tightened on his trigger, his patience eroding in the face of defiance from a man whose rank no longer commanded respect. The tension stretched toward breaking, toward violence that would solve nothing and destroy everything until a voice cut through the standoff with the weight of stars and decades of service. Stand down, Sergeant. I'll handle this personally. General Thomas Morrison stepped from the helicopter with the measured stride of a man who had seen too much to be impressed by displays of bravado or threatened by complications that lesser officers would find overwhelming. His face carried the weathering of 63 years and 4 wars lines carved by decisions that had cost lives and saved others by the burden of command that never truly lifted even in moments of peace. He had served beside Jack in conflicts that predated the Valdorian invasion, had trusted him with missions that official records would never acknowledge, had testified at his court-martial in defense of a man he believed had done the right thing regardless of what regulations demanded. His eyes found Jack's across the chaos of the landing zone, and something passed between them that required no words, no explanation, no justification beyond the bond forged in fires that had tested both men to their limits. "Jack, you look like hell." "Good to see you too, Tom. We need to talk." Morrison nodded and gestured toward the helicopter, his authority settling over the scene like a blanket that smothered the tension, threatening to ignite. The soldiers lowered their weapons and stepped back, their training overriding their instincts in response to command presence that decades of service had honed to perfection. Jack lifted Serafina from the rocks and carried her toward the aircraft, his arms aching with fatigue that had accumulated over days of impossible exertion, his heart pounding with hope that felt dangerous after so long without it. Fort Haven rose from the desert like a fortress built to withstand the end of the world, its walls bristling with weapons that had held the line against Valdorian assaults for 12 years of grinding attrition. Jack had served here before his demotion, had commanded defensive operations that had cost the enemy dearly for every inch of ground they tried to take. The base felt different now, smaller somehow, the corridors that had once represented power and purpose reduced to passages that led nowhere he wanted to go. Soldiers stopped and stared as he passed, their faces registering shock and confusion at the sight of a disgraced officer carrying an alien queen through halls that had been built to keep her kind out. The medical wing received Serafina with the reluctant professionalism of staff trained to treat wounds regardless of who bore them. Doctors examined her injuries with clinical detachment that couldn't quite mask their discomfort, their hands hesitating before touching flesh that belonged to an enemy who had ordered the deaths of colleagues and friends. Jack stood guard throughout the process, his presence a silent warning that whatever their feelings about the patient, their duty was to heal rather than harm. Morrison found him in the corridor outside the treatment room, 2 cups of coffee in hands that had signed orders sending men to die and had held the hands of widows who blamed him for losses he couldn't have prevented. He offered 1 cup to Jack and leaned against the wall beside him, 2 old soldiers sharing silence that said more than conversation ever could. "You want to tell me what the hell you're doing?" Jack carrying the Valdorian queen through enemy territory, threatening to shoot anyone who tries to take her from you. "This isn't like you." Jack sipped the coffee and let the bitter warmth spread through a body that had forgotten what comfort felt like. "She's not what we thought, Tom. None of this is what we thought. The invasion, the war, everything we've been fighting for 12 years, it's all been manipulation. Someone else has been pulling the strings." He told Morrison everything, starting from the moment he had found Serafina broken in the sand and ending with Keishel's holographic threat to execute her daughter in 72 hours. The general listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts as the story unfolded in all its impossible complexity. When Jack finished, the silence stretched between them like a bridge that might or might not support the weight of what needed to cross it. "You believe her? After everything her people have done, you actually believe she's telling the truth?" "I've spent 3 days with her, Tom. I've seen her at her weakest, heard her confess things that no enemy would admit to someone they were trying to deceive. She's not lying. She's a mother whose child has been stolen, a queen whose throne has been taken, a woman who has done terrible things and knows exactly how terrible they were. She wants to make it right, and she's willing to die trying." Morrison finished his coffee and crushed the cup in his fist, the gesture speaking of frustration that words couldn't adequately express. "Even if I believe you, even if everything you're saying is true, what do you expect me to do about it? We don't have the resources to mount a rescue operation into Valdorian territory. The brass would never approve it, and even if they did, we'd be sending men to die for an alien child who might already be dead." "Then let me go alone. Give me a ship, give me a weapon, and let me try. If I fail, you lose 1 disgraced soldier who was never going to amount to anything anyway. If I succeed, you get the intelligence that ends this war and a Valdorian queen who owes humanity a debt she'll spend the rest of her life repaying." The treatment room door opened before Morrison could respond, and a doctor emerged with the expression of someone who had encountered something beyond the scope of his training. His words came hesitant and uncertain, medical terminology struggling to describe physiology that textbooks had never anticipated. She's stable, General. The infection has been controlled and her wounds are healing at a rate that frankly shouldn't be possible. She's asking to speak with you both. Serafina lay propped against pillows that seemed inadequate to support the weight of everything she carried, her silver eyes finding Jack's face the moment he entered the room and holding it with intensity that made his chest tighten. The medical equipment surrounding her beeped and hummed with readings that meant nothing to human doctors, measurements of vital signs that followed rules written in the biology of another world. She looked stronger than she had in the cave, the treatments having restored enough of her strength to allow her to speak without the exhaustion that had colored every word she had managed before. General Morrison, thank you for coming. Morrison approached the bed with the caution of a man who had learned to distrust anything that seemed too easy, too convenient, too perfectly aligned with what he wanted to believe. Your Majesty, Jack tells me you have information that could help us end this war. I have more than information, General. I have a proposal that will require courage from your people and trust that I have done nothing to earn. But if you are willing to listen, I believe we can save my daughter, expose Kale's treachery, and create an opportunity for peace that neither of our species has been able to achieve in 12 years of bloodshed. She outlined her plan with the precision of a strategist who had commanded fleets across star systems, each element building upon the last until the full scope of what she proposed became clear. She would broadcast a message to the entire Valdorian Empire, revealing Kael's identity as her brother, exposing his role in their mother's assassination, and calling upon loyalist factions to rise against the usurper who had manipulated them all. The broadcast would create chaos within Valdorian command confusion that could be exploited to mount a rescue operation for Lyra before Kael could carry out his threatened execution. Success depended on timing, on coordination between human forces and Valdorian rebels, who had no reason to trust each other on faith that enemies could become allies when faced with a common threat. Morrison's face remained unreadable throughout her presentation, his tactical mind evaluating risks and opportunities with the cold calculation that command demanded. When she finished, he stood in silence for a long moment, his eyes moving between Serafina and Jack, as if searching for something that would tip the scales in one direction or the other. It's too risky. We'd be betting everything on the word of an enemy queen who might be playing us for fools. I can't authorize this operation. Jack stepped forward, his voice carrying conviction that surprised even himself. Then authorize me. I'll go alone if I have to, take whatever volunteers are willing to follow. If it works, we change the course of the war. If it fails, you can disavow any knowledge of my actions and write me off as a rogue element who acted against orders. Danny's voice came from the doorway where he had been standing unnoticed throughout the conversation. I'll go with him, sir. The colonel saved my life more times than I can count. If he believes in this, that's good enough for me. Morrison looked at the young soldier with something that might have been respect or might have been pity for idealism that war would eventually crush. Other voices joined Danny's from the quarter soldiers who had heard rumors of what was happening and had come to offer themselves for a mission that promised nothing except the chance to matter. The general closed his eyes and let out a breath that carried the weight of decisions he had never wanted to make. 6 volunteers. That's all I can spare without raising flags that will get us all court-martialed. You'll have 48 hours to plan and execute. After that, you're on your own. The training began within the hour. 6 soldiers gathered in a briefing room that had seen countless operations planned and executed with varying degrees of success. Jack stood before them with maps and diagrams that Serafina had provided intelligence about Valdorian ship layouts and security protocols that no human had ever possessed before. He taught them how to move through alien corridors, how to recognize the patterns of Valdorian patrols, how to exploit weaknesses in technology designed by minds that thought differently than their own. The soldiers listened with the focus of men who understood that their lives depended on absorbing every detail, on transforming information into instinct before they would be called upon to use it. Danny proved himself invaluable throughout the process, his youth translating into adaptability that older soldiers sometimes lacked, his questions revealing gaps in the plan that Jack's experience might have overlooked. The young man had grown during their days in the desert, had shed the naive eagerness that had once defined him and replaced it with something harder, more durable, more suited to the realities of what they were attempting. Jack watched his protege evolve, and felt something that he hadn't expected, a pride that transcended military hierarchy and touched on emotions he had thought himself too old and too damaged to experience. Serafina received her prosthetic legs on the second day Valdorian technology recovered from crashed ships and adapted by human engineers who had spent years studying enemy equipment. The limbs attached to her stumps with precision that seemed almost organic neural interfaces connecting with her nervous system to provide sensation and control that approximated what she had lost. She stood for the first time since the crash, her balance uncertain, her movements hesitant, but her eyes burning with determination that made the physical limitations seem irrelevant. Jack found her in the rehabilitation room that night, practicing walking patterns that her body no longer remembered, falling and rising and falling again, with the stubbornness of someone who refused to let weakness define her. He watched from the doorway until she noticed him, her silver eyes meeting his with an openness that had developed between them over days of shared vulnerability. "You should be resting. The mission launches in 18 hours. Her smile carried sadness that went beyond the physical pain she was experiencing. "I have rested enough. My daughter needs me, and I will not go to her as a cripple who must be carried." Jack entered the room and stood beside her, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough to respect the independence she was fighting to reclaim. "Why are you doing this? You could stay here. Let us handle the rescue, wait in safety while others take the risks." "Because Lyra is my daughter and I have spent 50 years unable to protect her. Because the soldiers who follow you deserve to know that the woman they are risking their lives for is willing to risk her own life beside them. Because you have shown me what courage looks like, Jack Mercer, and I will not dishonor your example by hiding while others fight my battles." He reached out and took her hand, felt the strange coolness of Valdorian skin against his palm, the alien texture that had become familiar through days of contact that neither of them had anticipated. "When this is over, when your daughter is safe and Kael is defeated, what then? What happens to us? I do not know. I do not know what peace will look like, or whether our species can learn to share a universe that both of us have claimed as our own. I know only that you have changed me, that the human who should have been my enemy has become the person I trust most in all the worlds I have seen. Whatever comes next, I will face it differently because of you." Her hand squeezed his with strength that surprised them both, her new legs steady beneath her as she stood without support for the first time. "When all of this ends, Jack, call your daughter. Tell her what you told me about regret and distance and love that survives despite the failures that should have destroyed it. Do not let another day pass without trying to repair what you have broken." The captured Valdorian transport lifted off from Fort Haven in the darkness before dawn, its engines carrying 6 human soldiers and 1 Valdorian queen toward a destination that promised death more certainly than survival. Jack sat in the pilot's seat with controls that Serafina had taught him to operate, his hands moving across interfaces designed for fingers that bent differently than his own, his mind focused on the task ahead with clarity that excluded everything except the mission. Danny occupied the co-pilot position, his role more observer than operator, his presence providing support that went beyond the practical requirements of the operation. The Valdorian command ship hung in orbit above Earth like a mechanical moon, its bulk blocking stars that had watched humanity's struggles since before their species had learned to look up and wonder. Security protocols accepted the transport's identification codes, Serafina's royal overrides still active in systems that KL had not thought to purge. They docked without challenge, stepped onto decks that hummed with power drawn from reactors that humans had not yet learned to build, moved through corridors where every shadow might hide enemies who would kill them without hesitation. Serafina's voice guided them through earpieces that transmitted across frequencies. Valdorian sensors couldn't detect her knowledge of the ship's layout, steering them around patrols and through passages that maintenance crews had abandoned. The soldiers moved with discipline that Jack had drilled into them during hours of training, their weapons ready, but controlled, their fear present, but contained by professionalism that made fear irrelevant. Lyra's cell occupied a secure section near the ship's command center, guarded by soldiers loyal to Kale, whose presence announced the value of what they protected. Jack assessed the situation with eyes that had evaluated countless tactical problems, calculated approaches that mathematics said couldn't work, and made the decision that command always demanded. "Danny, take point. Wilson and Chen cover the flanks. The rest of you stay with me until I give the signal. The assault lasted 37 seconds. Violence compressed into moments that felt like hours, blood and screaming, and the thunder of weapons that turned living beings into corpses. Danny moved through the chaos with skill that Jack had taught him, his shots precise, his movements economical, his fear channeled into effectiveness that would have impressed veterans twice his age. The guards fell, the door yielded to explosive charges, and the cell beyond revealed its treasure. Lyra stood pressed against the far wall, her small body trembling with fear that 50 years of captivity had failed to extinguish entirely. Her eyes were silver like her mother's, her features carrying echoes of a bloodline that had ruled worlds for generations, her vulnerability absolute in the face of armed strangers who had killed to reach her. Jack lowered his weapon and approached slowly, his voice soft despite the urgency that screamed for speed. "Your mother sent us. She's waiting for you just a few corridors away." The child's voice came small and uncertain, hope and suspicion warring in tones that broke Jack's heart. "Mother, my mother is dead. Uncle Kyle told me she died in a battle." "Your uncle lied. Your mother is alive, and she loves you more than anything in this universe or any other. She's fought through hell to reach you, and I promised her I would bring you back safely." Lyra's resistance crumbled, tears streaming down a face that had forgotten what hope felt like, her small hand reaching for Jack's with trust that he knew he didn't deserve, but accepted anyway. He lifted her into his arms and turned toward the exit, toward freedom that lay just meters away, toward a future that might finally offer something other than war. Cale stood in the doorway with 20 soldiers at his back, his smile carrying satisfaction that made Jack's blood freeze in his veins. How touching, the human hero saving the princess from the evil uncle. It's almost poetic, really, the way you've played into my hands. Jack set Lyra down and pushed her toward Danny, his eyes never leaving the Valdorian who blocked their escape. "Get her out of here, find another route, get to the transport, and don't stop for anything." Danny's protest came immediate and anguished. "Colonel, no, I won't leave you." "That's an order, Corporal. Your mission is to protect that child with your life. Everything else is secondary." The young soldier hesitated, decades of training, warring with loyalty that transcended military protocol. Lyra clung to Danny's leg, her small face turned toward Jack with confusion that pierced through the chaos of the moment. Danny made his choice, grabbed the child, and ran into the darkness of the corridor behind them, his footsteps fading as he carried out orders that Jack knew might be the last he ever gave. Cale watched them go with amusement that suggested he had expected nothing less, his soldiers parting to allow the escape while their weapons remained trained on Jack. "Alone at last. I've been curious about the human who convinced my sister to trust her enemies. What made you think you could succeed where entire armies have failed?" Jack raised his rifle, knowing the gesture was futile, knowing that 20 weapons would cut him down before he could fire a single shot. "I don't fight for success. I fight for the people I care about. That's something you'll never understand." Sentiment, the weakness of lesser species, the belief that individuals matter more than empires. My sister shared that weakness, and it cost her everything. Your sister is stronger than you'll ever be. She chose mercy when cruelty would have been easier, chose trust when suspicion would have been safer, chose love over power when love was all she had left. You've spent your entire life trying to prove you're better than her, and you've only succeeded in proving how small you really are. Cale's smile faded, replaced by fury that centuries of control couldn't entirely suppress. "Kill him." The soldiers raised their weapons, energy building in chambers designed to vaporize organic matter. Jack closed his eyes and thought of his daughter, of the call he had promised to make, of the words he would never get to say. The broadcast hit every speaker on the ship simultaneously, Serafina's voice cutting through the moment with authority that stopped fingers on triggers throughout the vessel. "People of the Valdorian Empire, I am Queen Serafina, your sovereign alive, and speaking to you from the ship that High Commander Kyle told you was his alone. Everything you have believed about my death, about this war, about the leadership that has guided our empire for 2 centuries has been a lie. Kyle is not a loyal servant who rose to power through merit. He is my brother, hidden from birth, raised in secret to become the instrument of factions who sought to control the throne through manipulation rather than courage. He arranged the assassination of our mother. He orchestrated my removal from power. He has held my daughter hostage to ensure my compliance with policies that served his ambition rather than our people's welfare. Kale's face twisted with rage that decades of scheming had never prepared him to handle. His voice emerged strangled in desperate command crumbling as truth spread through systems he had thought completely under his control. Lies. She's a traitor who fled to our enemies and now seeks to. I fled to our enemies because my own brother tried to murder me. I survived because a human soldier chose mercy over hatred, chose to save a life rather than take one, chose to see me as a person rather than a symbol of everything he had been taught to fear. I have learned more about honor and courage from that one human than I learned in 200 years of ruling an empire that prized power over compassion. The soldiers surrounding Jack lowered their weapons, their loyalty fracturing as doubt penetrated certainties that had sustained them through years of service. Some stepped back from Kale, their body language shifting from protection to distance, their allegiance redistributing in real time as the ground beneath their feet transformed into territory they no longer recognized. Kale drew his blade and lunged for Jack, rage overriding tactical calculation. Centuries of training, channeled into a single strike, meant to kill the symbol of everything that had destroyed his plans. Jack caught the blade on his rifle, felt the weapon shatter under the impact, felt the edge slice across his arm as he twisted away from a thrust that would have pierced his heart. The fight that followed was brief and brutal, two men testing each other with violence that left no room for mercy or hesitation. Kale was faster, stronger, trained in combat arts that humans had never encountered. Jack was experienced, adaptive, shaped by decades of fighting enemies who had consistently underestimated what a human being could accomplish when everything depended on the outcome. The knife found Jack's side, Valdorian's steel-piercing flesh that had survived wounds before but might not survive this one. Blood flowed hot and fast across his fingers as he staggered back, his vision blurring at the edges, his strength failing as his body registered damage it couldn't ignore. Serafina appeared in the doorway behind them, her new legs carrying her with speed that prosthetics shouldn't have allowed, her hands raised with power, building in palms that glowed with the silver light of royal gifts too long suppressed. Kale turned toward her, and in that moment of divided attention, Jack drove his combat knife through the gap between the Valdorian's armor plates, felt it pierce flesh, felt his enemy's body stiffen with shock that transcended physical pain. Kale fell to his knees, his hands grasping at the wound that would kill him. His eyes finding Serafina's face with something that might have been regret, or might have been nothing more than rage at being defeated by creatures he had always considered beneath his notice. You should have been the one they threw away. You were always weaker, always softer, always more concerned with being loved than being feared. Serafina knelt beside her dying brother, her hands taking his with gentleness that the moment didn't require but compassion demanded. I am sorry for what they did to you, Kyle. I am sorry for the child you were before ambition consumed everything you might have become. I wish things had been different. I wish I had known you existed before hatred was all you had left to offer. Kale's laugh came weak and bitter, blood-staining lips that had spoken lies for so long they had forgotten how to form truth. You still don't understand. Mercy is weakness. Compassion is vulnerability. Everything you value will destroy you in the end. Perhaps, but I would rather be destroyed by love than preserved by hatred. He died with her hands holding his, with words of forgiveness on her lips that he couldn't hear and wouldn't have accepted if he could. Serafina closed his eyes and stood her face carrying grief for a relationship that had never existed, for a brother who had been stolen from her, or before either of them could choose differently. Jack collapsed against the wall, his blood pooling on decks that had witnessed countless deaths, but none quite like this. Serafina rushed to his side, her hands pressing against wounds that refused to stop bleeding, her voice calling for medical assistance that might arrive too late to matter. Stay with me, Jack. Stay with me. His vision narrowed to her face, to silver eyes that had become familiar during days of shared survival, to features that should have been alien but had somehow become beautiful. Did they get out, Lyra and Danny? They're safe. Your soldiers got them to the transport. They're waiting for us. Good. That's good. The darkness closed around him with the gentleness of exhaustion, too profound to resist his last conscious thought, a prayer that the universe would grant him enough time to keep one final promise. The light returned, slowly filtering through eyelids that felt weighted with lead and exhaustion. Jack's first conscious breath brought pain that radiated from his side, sharp and insistent, a reminder that survival always carried a price. The ceiling above him was white and sterile, the hum of medical equipment filling the silence with mechanical rhythms that spoke of human technology rather than alien design. His hand moved instinctively toward his wound, and his fingers found bandages wrapped tight around a body that had somehow refused to surrender. Serafina sat beside his bed, her silver eyes watching him with relief that transcended the barriers of species and history. Her hand found his cool fingers intertwining with warm ones, the gesture carrying weight that neither of them needed to articulate. Her voice reached him soft and steady, carrying news that made the pain seem insignificant. Lyra is safe. Danny brought her home. The Loyalist factions have risen across the Empire, and KL's supporters are surrendering by the thousands. It's over, Jack. We won. 6 months passed like water through fingers, days blending into weeks that transformed the landscape of two civilizations, learning to see each other as something other than enemies. The Geneva Conference Hall held delegates from 17 nations and 3 Valdorian faction leaders, their presence marking the first formal peace negotiations in 12 years of warfare. Jack stood at the back of the chamber in civilian clothes, his uniform retired along with the rank he had been offered and declined. General Morrison had presented the Eagles personally, had spoken of heroism and sacrifice and the debt that humanity owed to the man who had carried their enemy to safety and changed the course of history. Jack had shaken his head and smiled his answer, simple and final. I already have everything I need, Tom. Give the promotion to someone who still wants to fight. Danny Reyes wore captain's bars, now his young face carrying the confidence of a soldier who had proven himself in fires that would have broken lesser men. He stood beside Jack as Serafina approached the podium, her new legs carrying her with grace that betrayed no hint of the trauma that had necessitated them. Her voice filled the chamber with authority that silenced whispers and commanded attention from beings who had spent years trying to destroy each other. I stand before you not as a conqueror seeking terms, but as a leader who has learned that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to rebuild. A human soldier taught me this truth. He carried me through fire when my own people left me to die. He showed mercy when hatred would have been easier trust, when suspicion would have been safer compassion, when cruelty would have cost him nothing. If our species can learn from his example, then peace is not merely possible, it is inevitable. The applause that followed echoed through halls that had witnessed the birth of treaties and the death of wars, but Jack barely heard it. His mind had already traveled elsewhere, to a phone call he had postponed for too long, to words he had practiced 1,000 times without finding the courage to speak. Sarah answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the wariness of a daughter who had learned to expect disappointment. Jack's throat tightened as he spoke each word, a bridge across 5 years of silence and regret. I know I've been a terrible father. I know I chose the wrong things, put duty before family, let the distance grow until it felt impossible to cross. But I love you, Sarah. I've always loved you. And if you'll let me, I'd like to try again. The sob that came through the phone told him everything he needed to know. The Mojave sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold as Jack stood beside Serafina at the place where their journey had begun. Lyra chased shadows across the sand, while Danny watched with the protective attention of an uncle who had earned the title through blood and sacrifice. Serafina's hand found Jack's, her touch familiar, now precious in ways that transcended the boundaries of worlds. What happens now, Jack Mercer? His answer came with the peace of a man who had finally found what he had been searching for through 3 wars and 52 years of living. Now we learn what peace looks like. Together. The desert wind carried their silence toward mountains that had witnessed humanity's darkest hours and brightest hopes. Jack Mercer had fought in 3 wars. But the most important battle had always been the one within the struggle to remain human when humanity seemed like weakness. Standing beside an alien queen who had become his closest friend, watching a child play in sand that had once been soaked with blood, he understood at last what victory truly meant. Not the destruction of enemies, but the transformation of them into something better. Not the preservation of hatred, but the courage to let it go. The sun set on 2 survivors who had found each other in the ashes of war and rose on a universe that would never be quite the same.